You're listening to the CD Baby DIY Music Podcast. Hey there, my name is Kevin, and this is the 14th episode of the CD Baby DIY Music Podcast. And for today's show, we have an interview with recording engineer extraordinaire Jeff Stuart Saltzman. Ever since I've moved to the Portland area and I've had conversations with other musicians about engineers and studios here in town, Jeff's name has always come up, and it's always come highly recommended. He's worked on a good portion of the records coming out of the Portland scene and also some national acts as well, like Sleater Kinney, the Decemberists, Death Cab for Cutie, Stars of Track and Field, and the list goes on. So we figured we would hunt him down and force him to make an appearance on the podcast. So whether you're new to recording and just trying to figure out how this whole process works, or you're a seasoned pro and tracked many records yourself, I think you'll find some great information about the whole process and recording and give you some things to think about. So let's get to that interview. So Jeff, why don't you open up with how you got into recording?
Well, I've been recording since I was like 16. I had a little 4-track. I was always really fascinated with tape recorders and microphones. In fact, when 4-tracks first came out, I used to stand at like guitar stores and like play with them. They'd have a little demo tape in there of like a rock band with guitars and bass, and I used to sit there with headphones until they kicked me out. And I finally bought one of my own. I played with that. I actually got pretty good on that 4-track. And then some music that I made got the attention of a label, and they wanted to put out a record, and I kind of convinced them to give me money for equipment rather than giving me a recording budget. So I was able to get a 16-track and a big board and some nice microphones and a couple pieces of outboard gear, and I kind of went into a personal hell for about a year trying to make this record. And then after that, a friend of mine who was a session musician in California started telling some of the local studio owners that I was this brilliant engineer, which I wasn't. I didn't really know what I was doing outside of my own gear and my own world, which I could make sound good. So these studio owners started calling me, and they would say, like, come on down and do the session, because they'd want the weekend off, and I'd come in, and it was pretty bad at first. I mean, I kind of cringe when I think about it. But the cool thing is that I kind of, it was different than what a lot of engineers today. Most engineers don't really grow up in that system, you know, and I was shown by professional engineers how to edit tape and calibrate a tape machine and run a session etiquette, how to deal with clients. Also, I had an amazing array of things I did in California, barbershop quartets, big band jazz, taiko drumming, a cappella music, college a cappella, did a lot of college a cappella, jazz groups. I didn't do much rock and roll actually early on, and that was really cool because I don't think a lot of younger guys they just start kind of recording the music they like, and they don't really get that sort of diverse sort of clientele, because it was just like stuff that was assigned to me, basically stuff the owners of these studios didn't want to do themselves. So yeah, it's kind of the last of the generation of people that kind of, because now you can just go to a store and buy a system and then set it up in your basement and you have a studio, and you can start recording bands right away. So it's kind of a different thing now. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just a different thing now.
Yeah.
So
before we jump in too deep, I wanted to mention that some of our listeners may have never recorded an album outside of tracking at home, doing demos on their computer. So can you briefly define the process of recording, mixing, and mastering so we're all on the same page?
Well, the old model of making a record, like in the old days before people had home recording stuff, is you'd go into a studio. They'd usually record musicians together live, which sometimes happens, but a lot of times it doesn't these days. And then maybe a few overdubs would be done. It was kind of about capturing a performance, and it still is in some worlds. And then I think that everyone knows about multi-track recording, sound on sound, where you can have something you recorded and then record over it without erasing the previous thing. So you'd overdub maybe vocals and maybe percussion, and then you'd sort of get a balance of all those things, a pleasing balance, so that it sounds like whatever you had set out to make it sound like. Maybe you wanted your band to sound like they're playing in a bus station, or maybe you wanted them to sound like they're playing in your lap, and you have some tools, time-based effects to make things sound far away or close, or pan to the left, pan to the right. So you do this balancing, and then you record the resulting mix that you've done, the balancing, onto another recorder of some sort, a 2-track thing or a digital recorder. So then you have this left-right mix of the way you want the mix, and then that is taken with hopefully another 9 or 10 songs to a mastering engineer, who basically goes through and sort of makes sure that those songs, because when you're mixing each individual song, you're not really paying attention to maybe one's a little bassy or maybe one's a little louder than another one. So mastering engineer basically makes it so it's kind of a smooth listen, so that the listener doesn't have to play with the volume or the tone controls a lot, and it just like seems like it's all happening at one time. So the mastering person then, collects all this stuff together and gives you some sort of format that you can take to a duplication company, and then the duplication company makes a glass master of that, which is used to make a stamper that, makes a CD, I guess. But that's all changing fast, and who knows in 5 years if what I just said will be relevant at all.
Well, for a band that's planning on going into the studio soon, what are some things they should be looking for when selecting an engineer and a studio? Well,
actually, it's way more important to search for the engineer than it is a studio. It's more important to find someone that understands what you're doing and is good at what they do, and someone who you've heard examples of their work, and it sounds like that's the sort of template you want laid over your work. Because engineers, even though they should be, they're not objective at all, and they have their own artistic barometers and their signposts of what good audio is and what are great records. And so you really want to find someone that you gel well with, so that it's not a struggle. And that's way more important than the studio, because if you have a really good engineer that understands what you're doing, then you can record it in a garage with just a couple of mics, and you'll get like pretty good results, rather than being in a really great studio that has all kinds of gear with some guy who has no idea of what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. But the studio is important too. Most younger musicians don't really know, like if they go on a studio's website, they don't really know what all the equipment is. Unless they have read up a lot on it. So equipment isn't too important. I think the best thing to do is to go to the place, take a studio tour. Almost any studio that, wants to have a good relationship with clients will take time out of their day to give you a tour. And I think it's really important that you feel comfortable there, that it doesn't feel like a dentist's office and you don't feel you can put a drink down on a table and stuff like that. You want to feel like you can just kick up your feet and like feel really comfortable making music, because the pressure of making a record for the first time, paying all that money, there's a lot that's going to be on your mind when you go to play that first chord of that first song. So you want to make sure that the studio's not contributing to any anxiety, that it's not a place that makes you feel uptight. And And a place, I think, I've always thought that it's more important for a studio to have interesting instruments and cool, like, old pianos or, like, weird zither instruments or cool old synthesizers. I think that's more important than having, like, great mics or anything, because those are the things that musicians will pick up and go like, oh, let's add this, and then that makes that cool overdub that works in a song that just made the bridge really special or something. So I think that having really cool gear is not as important as having really good instruments and having a really nice atmosphere.
So is it standard for potential clients who are trying to find an engineer to call you up and ask for a demo CD, you know, something that has tracks on it that you've either recorded or mastered, or do most people that contact you, are they already familiar with what you've done and your work that's out there?
Yeah, it's very seldom that I'm asked for a reel. I don't have one. So I just probably laugh sheepishly like I just did and say I don't have one. It's usually, at least here in town, I mean, I'm not really internationally known, but here in town, people either know what I do and like it, or they know what I do and go to someone else. So, I mean, I usually have people that, you know, come to me for a specific reason because they liked a record I've done. And then I don't really have to explain myself or try to sell myself, you know.
For an artist that is coming to you to track their album, what do you expect them to come to the studio prepared with? Someone might tell you that they have 5 songs ready to go, but when they get to the studio and you hear everything, it might really just be 5 rough ideas. I know you're on the clock and getting paid either way, but in order for them to have a good quality product and for them to get their money's worth, what should they be prepared with? And
yeah, I mean, I'm getting paid, I'm on the clock, but at the same time, I'm the kind of engineer that doesn't want people to, like, come out of the studio with something bad. Mm-hmm. And it's actually stressful for me, too, if people aren't prepared, because, yeah, I'm getting paid while we sit around and wait for the drummer to go buy a snare drum head, but it's just stressful because then we have less time to actually, you know, if there's already been a schedule set, we have less time to think about the more important things, you know, lunch, stuff like that, you know. So there's a huge difference, and a lot of younger musicians don't quite grasp this till later, but there's a huge difference between playing live and playing in the studio. Mm-hmm. Things that work live don't always work in the studio, and vice versa. In general, though, it's good to make sure all your equipment works. And as silly as that sounds, I mean, literally, I mean, I have set up recording sessions with people, and the drummer walks in and says, "Do you guys have drumsticks?" You know, like, here's this guy coming to record his first record, and he didn't have drumsticks. That really happened. And, you know, or people's guitars aren't intonated, you know, where they'll play a chord high up on the neck and it's just way out of tune, and they just never heard that or never really cared. So I would say, have your guitars intonated and serviced. You know, it's a pain in the butt. You'll be without your guitar for a week, and it's like $50, $60. But it makes things so much easier and makes things sound so much better, if that's what you're going for. Some people want to do punk rock, and it doesn't really matter about intonation. That's cool, too. But if you're going for something that, you know, is supposed to sound powerful and harmonically cohesive, then make sure things are intonated. Make sure that the drummer that, like, you know, once again, if the kind of music you're doing calls for it, make sure that the heads are new, that the drums are in good shape, that they sound good, that cymbals, you know, aren't, like, harsh sounding. And, you know, these are things that are hard for younger musicians to judge because they don't have a lot of experience yet. And part of the thing that I do is I usually end up helping folks and saying, like, no, use this crash cymbal instead of that one. That sounds better on tape. And that's basically the thing. That's the bottom line, too, with recording in a studio, is what sounds good in the speakers, you know. Mm-hmm. Even if a cymbal that a guy always hated and always just had against the wall in his rehearsal space, and he brings it and we put it on, and he's always hated that cymbal, but it just sounds good in the speakers, and you should just kind of go with that, you know. Because that's going to end up being the final thing, and the thing that's coming out of the speakers is what's important, not the fact that you use that brand new crash cymbal that you spend $150 on or whatever, you know, that might not just work, you know, it might be too bright or...
Do you typically like to track a band live in the studio?
I do, and it just seems to be more fun. It's hard work at the beginning to get everyone's balance right and get everything going, but it's great because then you finish a take and basically it's 80% done, you know. Mm-hmm. And then maybe you do a vocal overdub, or maybe a guitar solo overdub, and then you're done. I mean, that's with the most basic rock and roll kind of recording. Other things are more complex, and you can't really just do the elements live and then have it almost done. And there's lots more to do. It depends on what the band's going for. So it's always changing. That's what I like about my job, I guess.
What does the whole setup process look like? I know someone who's heading into the studio for the first time may think that they're gonna walk in and set up their gear like they would for a live show, and then 30 minutes later hit record and start tracking their records.
Sometimes it can look like that. If the band's really good and you know that you can get away with like recording them all in the same room and it's going to work because they just work well together it's important, for me. I try as much as I can to go see a band live before I record them. Sometimes I don't have the time, but it's important to see like exactly what's going on. I at least go to a rehearsal, because then I can catch some of these things before they happen. Like, that bass amp sounds like it could use some servicing, Let's maybe do that before we go in the studio. But it can be that. It can be like the band all in the same room. The band has to accept that everything that happens, though, once you're in the same room, it's all one thing, There's guitars and the drums and drums and the guitars, but it's a great sound, and like most of the classic records were done that way. The more modern approach is to do live recording, but have things isolated. Have amps in separate rooms, have the drummer in his own room, have the bass either going direct or through an amp in another room. If the singer's singing live, he's in another room, or he's in the control room with the engineer singing live. That's kind of the more common thing that you see, just because then if the rhythm guitarist maybe didn't hit the C sharp minor in the bridge, then you can go back and fix his thing, and you don't have to do everyone, because the rest of the band got this take that was the best version of that song they've ever played in their life, and that one bad chord doesn't wreck everything, so that usually ends up being the way you do it normally, I think.
What does your mic setup for the drums look like?
I've never mic'd a drum kit the same way twice. Really? Never. Micing drums, I get extremely bored, and I'm always trying different things. It's good to have a pair of overheads of some sort, but sometimes where I put them looks pretty weird. A close kick mic, a close snare mic, it's pretty standard, but it changes all the time, There's obviously this way of recording drums that kind of works, that's kind of been honed over the years, and I just kind of do that. I mean, once again, that to me, that's not as important as how the drums sound, the takes that the drummer's doing. I mean, that's a little more important, because really, if the drums sound good, you can mic the drums in the stupidest ways and make it work. This binaural headphone thing that I have that I was talking to you guys about, which was a pair of mics that you wear in your ears, I was even thinking, I bought it. It doesn't work very well, but I was thinking I still want to try just putting those on the drummer's head and having, recording the drummer that way. So I'm always up for, I don't know what that'll sound like. And every time he turns his head, the image will change, but that might be kind of cool. So I don't know. I mean, I found that the times I've been the most reckless recording drums are my favorite drum sounds. And the times that I really try to get all, scientific about it, those drum sounds are usually kind of boring. So, I mean, really, if the song's really good, no one really notices the kick drum. Like, your average listener doesn't notice that you've got this great snare sound. If the song is good, the snare can be almost anything. It can be mic'd from the bottom. It can be mic'd from the top. I mean, that stuff is not as important as just, like, how everyone's doing, when they're doing the take, and how the arrangement of the song is and all that stuff.
Do you see most drummers recording to a click track?
Yeah, it's funny because bands come in the studio, musicians are getting more and more recording savvy, just because they usually record at home, and and there's more information available now than like when I was a kid. Like there's tons of magazines, and so it's funny because bands come in and they're like, we're going to record with a click, right? They kind of expect that there's like this click that's always going in a recording studio. You just plug into the wall, and you plug the headphones in the wall, and there's a click already going. But I actually try to like discourage that, unless the song is supposed to have a metronomic kind of hypnotic kind of beat. But rock music doesn't seem to work, like especially if a drummer hasn't rehearsed with a click, it's usually a disaster, because it's a very hard thing to do, to play to a click and be able to play around the click and not make it sound like you're playing to a click. That takes years of practice. if I ask the drummer if he's ever played to a click, and he says he hasn't, then I'll try to discourage the click, because it can really drive them crazy. Mm-hmm. And it depends. If I've seen the band live or I went to rehearsal and the tempo seemed good to me, I mean, geez, I listen to Beatles records, Rolling Stones records, where the tempo's all over the place. I mean, it's amazing to me. Tempo to me in rock music should kind of be all over the place. It's rock music, you know. Yeah. Once again, though, it's totally, it's whatever thing that the band is going for. If they want this kind of really tight, like Gary Newman circa 1978 kind of thing, where it's just like really metronomic, it's almost like a drum machine, then yeah, you use a click. And if the drummer's good at doing it, it can actually be a great effect, because it's just this feel that just like is there all the time. Anyway, but I always try, if I can, to use a click that changes a little bit. Like in the chorus, it changes. It takes a little more time and a little more preparation, mm-hmm. but something that like speeds up a little bit in the chorus, because choruses should speed up in pop music to make it a little more exciting, mm-hmm. you know.
If the recording budget allows, are you still using a tape machine, or are you doing everything digitally these days?
If people really want to go to analog tape, I'll do analog tape. I record on analog tape for years. I am not as big. I think people really believe that's some sort of magic bullet that's going to make music better. And a really good engineer knows how to handle digital and not make it sound like digital. You know, I've heard records that were done all digitally that sound great. And the thing about analog is that it has to be an analog machine that's in good shape. A badly maintained analog machine is not worth, there's no romance to that. It has to be a well-maintained modern tape machine that's not going to give you trouble, mm-hmm. that's able to be calibrated properly. Then I'm into it. It takes a lot of time and it's expensive, and you don't have as much freedom changing things later, which is probably fine. But honestly, I haven't opened up a box of tape in like 2 years. Not because I don't want to, just because it just doesn't really happen much anymore. It's just, mm-hmm. you know... I actually, the other day, I was kind of thinking about it because I was setting up for a session, and I thought, wow, what if I forget how to calibrate a tape machine? Because I haven't done it in like 2 years. Yeah. And that was something I always prided myself on, is coming to the session early and like getting the tape machine going, which is, you know, something you don't see very much anymore. So I might actually forget. I don't know. I think it's kind of like riding a bike, though. I think I'd get into it. Yeah. But
for a band that's planning on booking a studio, how much time should they budget per song? Should they plan for 1 song a day, 2 songs a day? If they're really trying to record a nice sounding record, and that's not including mixing and mastering.
Well, it depends on what you're doing. That's the thing. You have to like look at what kind of music it is. I just made a record at a studio that took 3 days. I mean, we tracked it in 3 days completely, because it was just like kind of basic, kind of like rootsy rock and roll, and there was no backing vocals really, and we just kind of did the singing on each song, and then I brought it home here and I mixed it in a couple days and it was done. The song a day thing, that would be a little more generous. I mean, that depends on if there's going to be lots of backing vocals. Sometimes a band might say, oh, here in this bridge we want something to happen here, something's trippy, or some weird synthesizer middle section like Sticks Come Sail Away, you know. And then there's obviously going to be time when you have to figure that out, because no one in the band really plays keyboards. They know they want that, and they don't really have a keyboard, and the studio does, and you plug it in. And so honestly, that doesn't happen as much anymore. It's getting to the point where if bands want to invest more time like that, they're recording at home, because I just don't think on the level of the projects I work on and here in Portland, that there's those kind of budgets. Mm-hmm. Because a day in a studio, between me and the studio rate, it's kind of expensive. You know, 2 days of that and you could probably buy your own system, you know. Not like I'm condoning that.
So do you see bands doing that more and more, just coming to you to mix tracks as opposed to having you track all the drums and bass and everything else?
I see a lot more of that. I mean, I just set up a system here this week that is totally focused on mixing here. Because, I mean, that ends up being, you know, 60-70% of my work at this point. And it's fine, because I like mixing, and it's fun, and I hang out with my cats, and I get to do it here at home. It's a nice commute. Yeah. But I do like tracking also. So the tracking has tended to become a lot more rushed, you know. which means bands need to prepare way more beforehand. But even so, it's kind of a hybrid thing. I'd say the average way to do things, I think the people who record at home kind of know that recording drums and getting good basic tracks is something that they probably don't want to wrestle with. So I think what happens these days, more often than not, is doing basic tracks, getting good drum sounds, maybe the bass, maybe guitars, maybe not, and then handing that hard drive to a band, the engineer handing the hard drive to a band, and then they go home and they kind of toil, and then they do the Come Sail Away middle section on their time, and it usually ends up being better. But it's become a lot more stressful for musicians, because suddenly musicians who kind of just want to play guitar and sing or play drums are suddenly like having to worry about like what mics they need and recording levels, and is the compressor hitting too hard. And I've kind of watched it stress musicians out quite a bit, because it's a whole nother like way of thinking. It works best when there's maybe one guy in the band. Like I mixed this band, and the guy was kind of this percussionist. Like musically in the band, he didn't have as much to do, but he was also the engineer. So he could really concentrate. I mean, he'd play cowbell on a song or something live, but he was the guy that they'd record with, and actually he did a good job because he was able to be objective about everyone else's parts, and he wasn't like the singer trying to record his own vocals and trying to get a good vocal sound. And that can really drive musicians crazy. I feel sorry for musicians because it takes a lot of, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to, get things working and, and to make sure you're not distorting things or make sure things sound good. And so, some of the stuff I get here to mix is not exactly the best sounding individual tracks, but, I'm usually able to make it work. The art that's really kind of been lost these days is like people tracking for a record and understanding how things fit frequency-wise, like a puzzle kind of thing, And it seems like a lot of the stuff I get, things have just kind of been piled on, because usually with these newer like digital audio workstations, there's not really any front end. You don't really have any EQ or anything in the front end, so people just kind of get the best sounds they can, but there'll be like this huge bassy acoustic guitar sound that sounds bigger than the drums, and that'll just be kind of in there, and then I'm kind of the one who ends up having to trim out the stuff to make the guitar or the synthesizer fit. But a lot of the times when I get stuff, and there's nothing wrong with this, but there is an art to, and there's very few engineers I know here in town that even work this way, but just actual EQing and compressing things going in. So basically when you go to mix, you just bring the faders up and the song's there, basically. You don't have to it's not this confusing thing where there's just tons of sounds that are contrasting and masking each other. It's like, that's something that takes years to learn how to do. And so a lot of the stuff I get here to mix is a little bit of a mess, but that's part of my job. I don't mind it. It's fun.
That's one thing I've noticed a lot from artists who are recording tracks at home, and even some of the tracks I've done myself. It seems like it's really hard to rein in those frequencies. It just becomes a big mess. Is there something people can do to improve their hearing on that? Is it just their listening space?
That's the kind of thing that just takes a long time. But to help with it, you really have to think of the mix as being one thing. Obviously, it's a lot of separate elements, but when you listen to it, you really have to think of it as one thing. That's the thing that helped me, that really just totally dawned on me 5 or 6 years ago, Mm-hmm. The other thing is there has to be some sort of contrast, Not everything can be huge and in stereo in a mix, because then nothing sounds huge. And you have to kind of sacrifice some things to make the things that you want to sound huge. Sometimes to make the rock band sound huge, you have to make the vocals sound kind of tiny, or vice versa. Or if you want the guitars to sound really big and in stereo, you have to pan those out wide and have other things towed in and maybe smaller sounding. Not everything can be big and bassy sounding, because you just kind of end up with that sludge, that you were kind of describing. Mm-hmm. But getting to that point, it's basically you really have to slash and burn, and you can't be, and that's what's hard for people who have recorded their own thing to mix, because you tend to get kind of precious about sounds. And when someone else mixes, they'll just look at that and go oh, I'm just going to slash out all that, Mm-hmm. Not that people should be scared that that's all I do, but it's kind of this like totally objective view, or just like, oh, that just needs to be muted.
Yeah.
That sound is cool on its own, but it's doing this weird thing rhythmically that's making the drummer sound like he doesn't know what he's doing. Let's just mute that, and look, there's that song now. It sounds great. It's really grooving. So sometimes it's just that kind of thing. Trying to work simply, but it's that's been really hard. I was just advising a band that I'll be mixing soon to try to work simply, but people have unlimited tracks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a problem I've noticed. Just when I've been working, or other bands I've been talking to lately, they just keep going with tracks and tracks. And I was looking at something I did recently and was thinking, how would I take this to a mixing engineer? Do I need to eliminate some of these? Because we can't have 10 guitars in stereo on this bridge.
I mean, sometimes that works. There's some kind of like really cool, like modern metal stuff that's recorded like that. And I think it sounds really cool. But that stuff was very specifically recorded to, some of the guitar sounds are so tiny. Like if you sat there in the mix and you soloed out that track, it would sound awful because it's so tiny, but the way it kind of fits in and stacks on top of the other guitar sounds. But when you have like 10 guitars that are all the same sound and kind of a big bassy sound, what do you do? I mean, and sometimes things just rock more if it's only one guitar going. There's actually a tension to just one guitar going. I've always loved like 70s records like Black Sabbath. When Tony Iommi would start playing the guitar solo, the rhythm guitars stop because he's the only guitar player. Mm-hmm. So, and it's funny because the guitars are doubled, but he would double the lead also. He'd just go into the lead. But there's this cool tension to you hear the rhythm section just kind of like the bass player just kind of starts picking up there to fill up more sound. And those records still rock. I mean, I don't think anybody would say that Black Sabbath doesn't rock. And people scratch their head going like, wow, why does that rock so much? It's because it's so simple. Mm-hmm. And it's cool that you can hear through the mix. That it's not this dense, everything now, it seems like when I get mixes, people are trying to make it as intense as possible, thinking that the more things they pile on, the more intense it's going to be. Where actually, I think emotionally, it's more tense when you can really hear the individuals in there. And it's not this like kind of wash. But once again, it's all depends on the application, and sometimes the really dense thing is cool and it works too. I mean,
you mentioned that the average person isn't going to be able to EQ their stuff before it goes to tape and get it right. So would the best thing be, say I'm tracking an acoustic guitar part with a decent condenser mic, would the best thing be to just get a good track and let the engineer worry about all the EQing later?
If you don't have EQ, use the mic as an EQ, which is something that you read about all the time in recording magazines, which is really true. If the acoustic guitar sounds too bassy, move the mic back. Mm-hmm. If it sounds too thin, move the mic toward the sound hole. Try to do your EQing that way, which I think a lot of people do. Yeah. But then there's also the point of sometimes you have this idea and you feel very emotionally in the moment. So yeah, you gotta like just get it down, and maybe it doesn't sound perfect, but you did get the emotion, and that's important. And then, then you have someone else deal with it later, or you go in with a plug-in and maybe like try to fix it. But, obviously that's always going to be of paramount importance, is to get the feeling. And that's the art of recording, is kind of the balance between the emotion and the audio, and try to find something in the middle, that's not, that doesn't, and once again, it depends on what you're going for. Mm-hmm. Some people want all emotion. They don't care anything about fidelity, and that's fine, and those records are cool. And then some people kind of want all fidelity and want these shiny pop records that are really cool, and the emotional thing is there, but it's more kind of secondary to just kind of these, kind of like pop little masterpieces,
Most people will be recording on digital workstations at home, and it seems like the temptation is to crank the audio all the way to the point of almost peaking for each track, before you record the guitar or whatever. But is there a good rule of thumb to go by as far as getting levels? How much headroom should you leave?
It's actually been proven with listening, and I've proven it to myself, because when you first start recording with digital audio, when I first started recording, the whole thing was, well, you want to get all 24 bits. You got to record as high a level as you can. But now they've found that if you're mixing, especially if you're mixing inside the computer, that if your levels are lower, your audio sounds a lot better, because then your 2 mix the thing that all these sounds are being fed into this left-right mix, that's actually a lot less choked sounding. And really, like with this modern digital stuff, if you're even just tickling the middle, nice healthy signal that's not like, now when I record, I just tickle the middle of the volume range, and everything sounds so much better. And your plugins react better because they're not being like hit so hard. And headroom in the digital world is really important. Headroom in the analog world is a lot more forgiving. I mean, analog consoles, analog tape machines just tend to kind of like absorb that and sound cooler, whereas in the digital world, it's not cooler. Getting more signal on there actually makes things sound cloudier. And, when you're mixing inside a computer and you're using lots of tracks, there tends to be this kind of hazy, kind of amorphous sound. If your levels are lower, that won't happen as much. I promise. I guarantee you. You can call me if I'm wrong. You can call me and yell at me. But there's articles about it on the internet. There's been like a lot of papers that people have written about keeping the levels down in digital audio workstations. You don't have to get every last 24th bit.
And when you're talking about looking at a dB meter or a VU meter when you're getting the signal, should it be around -6? Would that be the middle?
I don't know. I mean, I'll have to look at my meter here. Yeah, -6. Good. See, Kevin knows more than I do. Let's interview him. Just so it's nice and healthy.
Yeah.
So it's like, you don't want it too quiet because then you can sometimes you can hear some noise in there just of the digital processing, but anywhere in the middle of the volume range is fine, and it sounds great, and it'll sound better when you try to mix a lot of things later.
For someone who's trying to get some good drum tracks at home and maybe only has 3 or 4 inputs, is there any sort of miking pattern you would recommend for them to capture the kit as best they can?
The most important thing with drums is relative phase. That is probably too advanced a concept to really get into at this point. You can talk about that for a whole day. You can teach a college course on relative phase. Really the most important thing is whatever the overhead is, the thing that's picking up the whole drum kit, whether it be in front of the drums, over the drums, on the side, or maybe it's 2 mics doing that, those are your most important things. The drums should sound like the drums in that mic. The close mics are more to just kind of add a little punch and a little bit of definition to the overall drum pickup. It's really important to think of the drums as one thing. And
should they be using condenser mics for that?
But dynamic mics make fine overhead mics, as silly as that sounds. I actually they have to be good condenser mic or good dynamic mics that have lots of high frequency response, so you get the crispness you want, if that's what you're going for. But yeah, they work great. So I wouldn't say, some people like ribbon mics as overhead, some people like condensers. It depends on the drum kit. It really depends on the room you're in. The room is 50% of it.
If someone is recording drums at their house and have a couple room options, is there a particular room they should go for?
It depends on what kind of music you're doing and what you want the drums to do. If you want a really bright, kind of brash sounding kit, then you want to put it in the bright room. If you want something that's more kind of intimate and kind of more defined, then you want to mic closer and you want to put blankets around. There's so many different scenarios with drums, but that's another important thing to think about, the context of the drums. Some people just approach drum miking like, oh, let's just make it huge sounding like Bonham. And then later, when they've piled on all this stuff, that just doesn't really work as much anymore because they don't have as much definition, So it's really important to think about how the drums are actually fitting in and not just try to make them as huge sounding as possible. Sometimes small drums in a certain mix will sound bigger. So I just shrugged my shoulders and made a face there just for the listeners. We're getting into a realm where it's kind of like so application dependent that it's hard for me to say because...
So they should just use their ears.
Let me just say this. The most important thing out of all this we're talking about, and the thing that will make all of what you're asking me make sense, is just knowing your speakers. Having a pair of speakers that are in a space that stay where they are, like it's a predictable listening environment, and you listen to a lot of other people's music on there. You listen to CDs. I mean, anytime I'm going to mix, I put on a CD that I like, kind of warm up my ears. know your speakers. Once you know your speakers and you know exactly how the low end is in your speakers and how the high end is, then all this stuff you're asking me just becomes apparent by like putting something on the drive, recording a little audio like the drummer, and then listening, and then, you know, and then saying, oh, that's too bright, or we need more brightness, because that's the most important the most important gear in your studio, beyond mics, beyond what you're recording to, is your speakers. Mm-hmm. Or it could be headphones. I don't work with headphones, but some people know their headphones. And it has to be predictable. Can't be speakers that are moved every day. It doesn't even matter what kind of speakers they are, as long as you know them. And when you record audio and listen back on those speakers, you can react to it in some way. Whether it be like, that sounds perfect, or that's going to need some 5K, or that's going to need some 10K cut. Mm-hmm. That's really the most important thing. Once you get a good listening environment and you know your speakers, you're the greatest engineer ever. Serious. That's the thing that took me so long to learn, and I wish someone had told me that 20 years ago. But it's all about the speakers and knowing your listening environment. And then drums, guitars, anything you were going to ask me, that's how you judge.
Mm-hmm. So I've got all my tracks done, my drums, guitar, bass, whatever, and I did it all at home. So now I contact someone like you. I want you to mix it for me. What's the best way for me to organize the files so when I bring it to you, it's easy for you to open everything up and get started mixing without having to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what I've done and where my files are located?
If you're working on the same type of system that I have, then you would just bring me a session, because that'll translate. Mm-hmm. You bring it to me on a hard drive. If you're working on another platform, all these platforms work with similar file. They all work with the same file type. So as long as you have all the files with the same start point, I can set up a session in my system and just load in the tracks one at a time. Mm-hmm. This stuff is all over the internet as far as preparing your tracks for mixing, but, you know, making sure they're named clearly, you know, not like Rick or something, you know. What does that mean? Is it Rick playing tambourine or guitar? Just like, and no cute, you know, mixers don't usually like cute names, you know, like Space Ball or whatever. Or, sorry, that was a weird Mel Brooks reference. Let's edit that out.
But that would be weird.
Or, you know, like no cutesy names, just like electric guitar 1, electric guitar 2, and try to keep it short, because usually when you're looking at a mix page in any sort of digital audio workstation, you want to be able to look at the name real quick. And if there's a bunch of numbers in front of the name and the name doesn't even get in there, if it has to be shortened, if it's a small window, then it's kind of hard to read it. So just really clear, like bass, you know, harmonies at end, vocal, chorus harmonies, lead vocal. And then the other thing that most mixers would prefer to not have in there is a bunch of plugins and automation, unless the automation is it has so much artistic weight in that mix. Like, you spent a long time getting this one fade up of all these instruments to happen. That's something that you could include, but any little automation things, because in most digital audio workstations, once you automate a fader, the fader's locked up. And so it's really hard for the mix person to actually do anything. I mean, they can put a trim plugin in, but it's much nicer to just have a session that's completely clear and then let the person do the automation again. I mean, basically, I think of it as kind of, you know, just because I'm from the analog world where you just put on a tape and then you'd start putting up faders. Mm-hmm. But now, you know, you get sessions and there's tons of automation and they've inserted all these plugins, and maybe some mixers can deal with that. I have trouble with that. I just end up clearing out all the plugins usually, and I usually clear out the automation. If you have plugins on a sound that becomes very signature to that song, print it like that. You know, either Audio Suite the stuff or bus it through like that. Usually the mixer person wants to put up the song and start mixing. Mm-hmm. They don't want to dig through 5 tambourine tracks that you have up with different feels. And that happened to a friend of mine. I'm serious. Like, they left him 5 different tambourine tracks. Like, he's not being paid to make that decision. That's a producer's decision. Yeah. You know, a mixer mixes. Although that's become a lot more blurred these days, and I do a lot of production in my mixes. But for the most part, make your decisions. If you had 5 mics on a guitar amp, a single guitar amp, you mic'd like stereo room and then like the back of the amp and the front of the amp. If you want to do that, mix those all together. Make a blend that you like. Don't just have these 5 faders floating there. The mixer is probably not going to want to change that too much from what you did. And if he did, include the raw tracks too, if you've done that bounce, so if the mixer does want to change your blend, then he can. But normally with me, I just go with whatever someone gives me.
If it's a song that you didn't record and you're just mixing for somebody and you've never heard it before, do you typically want a rough stereo mix from the band just to get an idea of what they're looking for?
Yeah, because it usually tells me, oh, okay, this keyboard part, that's like the anchor of the song. I would never have known that. If I had put up the faders, I would have thought this acoustic guitar was, but okay, now I see that's, yeah. So yeah, that's very important.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks, Jeff. Any final words of wisdom for us?
I think the biggest nugget that I gave you was the speaker thing. That's so important, and it's something that's totally overlooked. People ask me all the time, what kind of speaker should I buy? Ones that you just learn them, because there's no such thing as a flat monitor, because even if a manufacturer claims that a monitor is flat, as soon as you introduce it into any room, it's not flat at all anymore. Mm-hmm. And so you have to learn those speakers in that environment. Mm-hmm. I feel sorry for freelancers. I mean, I'm a freelancer, but I work at studios where I've gotten to know the monitoring system, but guys who jump around from studio to studio because the monitoring is always different. Mm-hmm. Some guys bring their own speakers, and I think that's smart. And that's why all these big LA guys work in the same room, the mixer guys, Jack Joseph Puig and Tom Lardalge, and, whether you like those guys or not, I mean, they work in these rooms where they sit in front of the same monitors every time, and so they can react instantly. There's no, there's no guesswork. Like, wait, where's the bass on these monitors? 'Cause, so that's my main word of wisdom.
Well, thanks for talking to us.
Sure.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the CD Baby DIY Music Podcast. Don't forget, you can email us your thoughts, comments, and feedback to info@cdbabypodcast.com. We really appreciate hearing from you guys. And also, the website has a bunch of great resources outside of the show. It has show notes and a whole bunch of other links and articles of interest, and you can check those out at cdbabypodcast.com. You've been listening to the CD Baby DIY Music Podcast, broadcasting from Portland, Oregon, USA.